Here are Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie.
Good evening. We're coming on the air to bring you a historic moment for the country. President Biden, moments away from addressing the nation about why he dropped out of the presidential race.
This will be the first time we've heard directly from the president since he made that announcement on Sunday that he was ending his bid for a second term and instead endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris.
His decision as he was recovering from COVID was a political earthquake. It's been more than half a century since a sitting president decided not to pursue their final term, and never in modern times has it happened this close to an election.
Well, the president is expected to frame his exit from the race as the passing of the torch to the next generation and in service of defending democracy. His decision came after weeks of growing pressure from within his own party to step aside amid concerns that his age and poor debate performance made it nearly impossible for him to beat former President Trump in November.
The president will be speaking from the Oval Office tonight, only his fourth address from there as president, the venue usually reserved for moments of national crisis or major policy proposals. This address will be uniquely personal, however.
Yeah, so the president has 6 more months in office tonight, will likely begin his efforts to shape his legacy. So let's take you to the West Wing of the White House, the Oval Office, and here's President Biden.
My fellow Americans, I'm speaking to you tonight from behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. In this sacred space, I'm surrounded by portraits of extraordinary American presidents. Thomas Jefferson wrote the immortal words that guide this nation. George Washington, who showed us presidents are not kings. Abraham Lincoln, who implored us to reject malice. Franklin Roosevelt, who inspired us to reject fear. I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think is more important than any title. I draw strength and I find joy in working for the American people. But this sacred task of perfecting our union is not about me. It's about you, your families, your futures. It's about we, the people. And we can never forget that. And I never have. I've made it clear that I believe America is at an inflection point. One of those rare moments in history when the decisions we make now will determine our fate of our nation and the world for decades to come. America's going to have to choose between moving forward or backward, between hope and hate, between unity and division. We have to decide, do we still believe in honesty, decency, respect, freedom, justice, and democracy? In this moment, we can see those we disagree with not as enemies, but as fellow Americans. Can we do that? Does character in public life still matter? I believe I know the answer to these questions because I know you, the American people, and I know this. We are a great nation because we are good people. When you elected me to this office, I promised to always level with you, to tell you the truth. And the truth, the sacred cause of this country is larger than any one of us. And those of us who cherish that cause, cherish it so much, a cause of American democracy itself, must unite to protect it. You know, in recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. But there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now. Over the next 6 months, I'll be focused on doing my job as president. That means I'll continue to lower costs for hardworking families, grow our economy. I'll keep defending our personal freedoms and our civil rights, from the right to vote to the right to choose. I'll keep calling out hate and extremism. Make it clear there is no place in America for political violence or any violence ever, period. I'm going to keep speaking out to protect our kids from gun violence, our planet from climate crisis that is the existential threat. And I will keep fighting for my cancer moonshot so we can end cancer as we know it, because we can do it. And I'm going to call for Supreme Court reform, because this is critical to our democracy, Supreme Court reform. You know, I will keep working to ensure America remains strong and secure and the leader of the free world. I'm the first president in this century to report to the American people that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world. We'll keep rallying a coalition of proud nations to stop Putin from taking over Ukraine and doing more damage. We'll keep NATO stronger, and I'll make it more powerful and more united than any time in all of our history. I'll keep doing the same for our allies in the Pacific. You know, when I came to office, the conventional wisdom was that China would inevitably surpass the United States. That's not the case anymore. And I'm going to keep working to end the war in Gaza, bring home all the hostages, and bring peace and security to the Middle East and end this war. We're also working around the clock to bring home Americans being unjustly detained all around the world. You know, we've come so far since my inauguration. On that day, I told you, as I stood in we stood in a winter of peril and a winter of possibilities. Peril and possibilities. We were in the grip of the worst pandemic in the century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. But we came together as Americans, and we got through it. We emerged stronger, more prosperous, and more secure. Today, we have the strongest economy in the world, creating nearly 16 million new jobs, a record. Wages are up. Inflation continues to come down. The racial wealth gap is the lowest it's been in 20 years. We're literally rebuilding our entire nation, urban, suburban, rural, and tribal communities. Manufacturing has come back to America. We're leading the world again in chips and science and innovation. We finally beat Big Pharma after all these years to lower the cost of prescription drugs for seniors. And I'm going to keep fighting to make sure we lower the cost for everyone, not just seniors. More people have health care today in America than ever before. And I signed one of the most significant laws helping millions of veterans and their families who were exposed to toxic materials. You know, the most significant climate law ever in the history of the world. The first major gun safety law in 30 years. And today, the violent crime rate is at a 50-year low. We're also securing our border. Border crossings are lower today than when the previous administration left office. I've kept my commitment to appoint the first black woman to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. I also kept my commitment to have an administration that looks like America and be a president for all Americans. That's what I've done. I ran for president 4 years ago because I believed and still do that the soul of America was at stake. The very nature of who we are was at stake. And that's still the case. America's an idea. An idea stronger than any army, bigger than any ocean, more powerful than any dictator or tyrant. It's the most powerful idea in the history of the world. That idea is that we hold these truths to be self-evident. We're all created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We've never fully lived up to this sacred idea, but we've never walked away from it either. And I do not believe the American people will walk away from it now. In just a few months, the American people will choose the course of America's future. I made my choice. I've made my views known. I would like to thank our great Vice President Kamala Harris. She's experienced, she's tough, she's capable. She's been an incredible partner to me and a leader for our country. Now the choice is up to you, the American people. When you make that choice, remember the words of Benjamin Franklin is hanging on my wall here in the Oval Office, alongside the busts of Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Cesar Chavez. When Ben Franklin was asked, as he emerged from the convention going on, whether the founders have given America a monarchy or republic, Franklin's response was, a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. Whether we keep our republic is now in your hands. My fellow Americans, it's been the privilege of my life to serve this nation for over 50 years. Nowhere else on earth could a kid with a stutter from modest beginnings in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Claymont, Delaware, one day sit behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office as President of the United States. But here I am. That's what's so special about America. We're a nation of promise and possibilities, of dreamers and doers, of ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. I've given my heart and my soul to our nation, like so many others. I've been blessed a million times in return with the love and support of the American people. I hope you have some idea how grateful I am to all of you. The great thing about America is here, kings and dictators do not rule, the people do. History is in your hands. The power is in your hands. The idea of America lies in your hands. We just have to keep faith. Keep the faith. And remember who we are. We're the United States of America. And there's simply nothing beyond our capacity when we do it together. So let's act together. Preserve our democracy. God bless you all. And may God protect our troops. Thank you.
The 46th President of the United States speaking from the Oval Office and framing this in the starkest imaginable terms, saying it is democracy on the line. He said, I revere this office, but I love my country more. And he talked, Lester, about the need to unite his party. He argued that his record merited a second term, but it was clear to him that it was time to pass the torch, in his words.
Let's bring in our NBC News team covering all things politics. Kristen Welker, moderator of Meet the Press. Hallie Jackson is our senior Washington correspondent, and Peter Alexander, chief White House correspondent. Kristen, let me begin with you. The president, by all accounts, resisted coming off the ticket for days as people lined up to show him polling data. Tonight, did he seem like a man who was all in on this concept?
He did, Lester, and just taking a step back, this was a speech for the history books, just as when LBJ announced he wasn't going to run for re-election in 1968, and we have seen those clips played and replayed throughout time. This is the type of speech that will be replayed for decades to come. Lester, you're absolutely right. It is clear that President Biden wanted to convey that he had come to terms with the reality of the situation. And I'll just read that soundbite, Savannah, that you referenced, because it was a powerful one. He says, I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future all merit a second term, but nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. Stunning to hear him talk about personal ambition and to acknowledge that he clearly wrestled with this decision. This also, I think, can be viewed as what he would like to be the first draft of how his legacy is remembered. Right off the bat, you heard him talk about past presidents who he reveres, from Lincoln, Jefferson, Roosevelt. He also talked about the things he says he will continue to fight for: reproductive rights, voting rights. He says there will be reforms, or at least he will call for that on the Supreme Court. And he really ended this, Lester and Savannah, with a call to action saying history is in your hands. So it is clear he was delivering this speech for the history books with the knowledge that, again, these words will be played and replayed throughout time, Lester and Savannah.
Kristen Young, we want to turn to Hallie and bring her into this conversation as well. It wasn't a campaign speech, but he certainly put the choice in very dramatic terms, asking the question of the American people, does character still matter? Does freedom, does justice still matter?
You took the words right out of my mouth, Savannah, because that's what jumped out to me, too, that even at this moment, President Biden is still casting this decision come November in the same terms that he did when it was him that was going to be up against former President Trump. This idea of character, who has it and who has the fortitude to lead the country forward, who can stand up and be accountable and be able to lead this country forward. You're right that it was not a campaign speech. He clearly had his eye on the history books, but he did nod to the person who he has now endorsed to take the top of the ticket, and that is his vice president, Kamala Harris, saying that he wants to thank her. She's experienced, she's tough, she's capable, that she's been an incredible partner to him and will be a great leader for the country moving forward. There will likely be time, Savannah, and President Biden has alluded to this, for him to get out on the campaign trail and make the case more forcefully for a Harris presidency. That was not this moment, but it was still a nod to that. I will tell you that in my conversations with Democrats over the course of the last couple of days here, there is a moment where I think Democrats want to give President Biden the space and the time to have this moment. They are grateful to him, by and large, for what he has done for the country, and frankly, grateful that he has made this decision in most corners to step off the ticket here. And I've heard a lot over the last couple of days about what Democrats see as the energy and the enthusiasm turning now to Vice President Harris. And you look at it by the numbers, for example, she has raised, her campaign says, a staggering $120+ million in just a few days since President Biden dropped off the ticket and endorsed her. You look at voter registration. Vote.org says nearly 40,000 people in just those first 2 days since the president dropped off came and registered to vote. I've been hearing about that from Democratic leaders in Congress and beyond, that they feel like this is a moment for enthusiasm for the Democratic Party. The question is, of course, does that translate into votes come November? But for this moment for President Biden, it was not about that full-throated call for his successor. He did acknowledge passing the torch. He did acknowledge, of course, saying that it is time for a younger voice. He said, yes, it is time for that sort of new voice and, yes, a younger voice. But for him, this was about, on his terms, laying out how he sees his legacy moving forward, Savannah and Lester.
And Peter, we understand at the White House there was going to be a viewing moment, or at least staffers could gather to watch this speech. There's no getting around that this is a lame duck presidency now. Do you feel it? Are you feeling it at the White House?
Well, Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary today, disputed that it's a lame duck presidency, but to be clear, it's going to be very difficult over the course of these next 6 months to get anything done in terms of legislative accomplishments, facing a recalcitrant Senate Republican group of Senate Republicans right now. I will tell you, pulling back the curtain a bit tonight, that I am told on the second floor of the White House residence, what's called the State Floor, that hundreds of White House staffers and members of the vice president's staff as well have gathered together tonight. They were watching on big screens with pizza brought in, the military band playing as well, described to me as a joyful gathering, but also a bittersweet one, where they were sharing hugs and memories. The first opportunity for many of these staffers to sort of see each other and gather together face to face since the president made this formal announcement. A couple things I'm struck by in this is this in many ways was a farewell speech for the president, but it's only the first of several to come. He will speak again on this issue more broadly with the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, to take place in Chicago. Our reporting is that he is already retooling his message for that address to focus more heavily on Kamala Harris. And of course, he will deliver another more formal farewell address in the closing days of his time in office. And what is striking, though, even as the focus tonight is on President Biden, the focus quickly turns to the vice president and who she may select as her vice president as well. We have listed some of the Democratic governors she's looking at: Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Roy Cooper of North Carolina, Andy Beshear of Kentucky. And multiple sources familiar with the process tonight tell NBC News that among the top priorities for Harris in selecting that person to share the ticket with her is trying to find someone who appeals to those individuals that were brought to the table by President Biden himself, particularly older white voters and suburban women. Among the things we'll be watching over the course of the several weeks ahead.
All right, Peter Alexander, thank you.
When the president ending his speech with a personal note saying he hopes the American people know how grateful he is. He talked about being a kid with a stutter from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who reached the heights of political office here in this country, and only in America, he says, would that be possible. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have more throughout the night on our streaming channel, NBC News Now, and of course, tomorrow morning on Today. I'm Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm Lester Holt. For all of us here at NBC News, thank you for watching, and good night.
We are coming on the air with breaking news tonight as we continue our NBC News special report coverage. I'm Hallie Jackson, live in Washington, just down the street from where you saw President Joe Biden wrapping off that Oval Office address just a couple of minutes ago. His first speech since he withdrew from the race over the weekend. His first public remarks to the American people. You saw them here live. They lasted roughly 12, 13 minutes, talking about why he made this decision, casting this in terms of his historical legacy moving forward, a full-throated endorsement of Kamala Harris to take his place, and his priorities for the last 6 months left in the White House here. Listen to a little bit of what the president had to say.
It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think is more important than any title. I draw strength and I find joy in working for the American people. But this sacred task of perfecting our union is not about me. It's about you, your families, your futures. It's about we, the people. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. In just a few months, the American people will choose the course of America's future. I made my choice. I've made my views known. I would like to thank our great Vice President Kamala Harris. She's experienced, she's tough, she's capable. Now the choice is up to you, the American people.
President Biden there from the Oval Office. NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell is joining us now. And it's interesting to hear, Kelly, who was in the room as the president was delivering this address. He was surrounded by his family, by his wife, by several children and grandchildren who were in the room with him at what, as we've been talking about, has been a legacy moment for him.
And that is not typical for an Oval Office address, because usually that venue is used for a national emergency, an urgent policy issue. This obviously had far more personal overtones, almost a farewell to the nation. He will certainly do a farewell speech at the very end of his term before the inauguration. But this was a critical moment, and they have been on that journey with him. Certainly the First Lady, one of his closest advisors. And we have known by covering Joe Biden that relying on family support and their advice, and because families are very much a part of public life, having them there for this moment certainly made a lot of sense. The president did talk in personal terms, but also historical terms, casting his moment against some of the great moments of history, names that could cross over the current political divide and have people thinking about our shared legacy, going back to invoking Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, people who helped to shape what the country is supposed to be and what it is not supposed to be, where he references not having a king, that this is a republic and it takes work to keep it. So for the president, this was about trying to set up the choice for Americans without being overtly political. And certainly people will hear the politics in it, but it was an official address from the office, and he veered along the line of stating what he believes are the stakes of the election without making it a campaign speech. And so this is a moment for the president to set the course for the next 6 months, talking a bit about the issues he wants to focus on, and we'll see some of that in the days ahead when he referenced things like wanting to propose changes to the Supreme Court, dealing with issues like trying to reduce costs. All of those things that are front burner for many Americans will be a part of what he's doing day to day going forward.
You are so right, Kelly, in that policy through line that was woven throughout this speech here, as he also cast it in historical terms. But you've covered Washington a while. I've been here for a little bit. It's tough to do that even at a time of extreme bipartisanship, let's say, at a time 6 months from an election, 4 months, I should say, from an election. What are the chances that some of what the president wants to get done actually happen here moving forward?
In a legislative way, that will be challenging. But one of the things that we certainly know is there actually can be legislation that is not necessarily controversial. It's not about the border or it's not about reproductive rights. But there are pieces of legislation that can move through and do. They just often don't get a lot of attention. But there can be some ways that president can work with Congress. But that will not be the big issues. What he will try to do is set an agenda. Some of that will parallel what's being talked about on the campaign trail. Some of it will be using his power through executive actions, setting up a conversation for the future when it comes to the Supreme Court, concerns about things like the ethics of the Supreme Court, and can that be codified in a way that it is not now? Or could there be age limits for the Supreme Court? That could be an area where he talked about believing he merited a second term, believing he could do it, but then ultimately deciding that it was better as a moment of transition to, and he acknowledged, to hand it off to someone younger. So it is policy, it is infused with politics, and it's also about agenda and legacy building over these next several months for the president. I'm a believer that presidents are always consequential, even when they are technically lame duck, because we only have one at a time. Yeah. And so the president will have an opportunity now to use the time he has without the burdens of also campaigning. It'll be interesting to watch in the months ahead how people perceive his wellness after all the scrutiny that there has been on questions of decline, questions of his physical limitations. Will any of that be viewed differently now? The press secretary today said this decision was not motivated by health. It was motivated by the issues that he talked about tonight.
Kelly O'Donnell, our senior White House correspondent outside the White House for us tonight. Kelly, thank you. A big moment for President Biden. A lot of eyeballs on him at this moment, including, as our Trump campaign correspondent Garrett Haake is joining us now, including that of former President Trump, who we understand watched that address from his now former political opponent.
That's right. We understand that the former president watched the address from his campaign plane tonight after this rally. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what he has to say about it individually. But his campaign is already fundraising off of it, suggesting that Joe Biden is still not fit to serve in their view. This was obviously not a campaign speech, but watching this about an hour after watching the former president on stage in North Carolina, the contrast couldn't be more stark. Here you had the former president attacking both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in, frankly, vicious personal terms.
He said, I'm not going to be nice, and then he was not.
Exactly. Right. I mean, we were talking together about a week ago about the unifying message that the former president was hoping.
He said he wanted to deliver.
That's right, that he was hoping to project for this country and for the remainder of the campaign. That is now entirely gone from Donald Trump's vocabulary, even when you see President Biden in this moment, I think, trying to throw his arm around the country a little bit here in his exit from the public stage.
Yeah. Garrett, stand by for a second, because we want to get the Republican perspective on this, of course, with House Majority Whip Congressman Tom Emmer from Minnesota. I believe the congressman is joining us now. Thank you so much for joining us, sir, and for your time tonight.
Good to be with you, Hallie.
Your response to what you heard from President Biden tonight.
Well, I think the first part of the speech was kind of sad. It looked like a hostage video. I mean, he's literally been knifed by Obama and pushed over the cliff by Pelosi. He's got people he trusted for 50 years that pushed him out of the office, which was kind of sad to watch. And then I would say the last half of it, he gaslit America again, telling false information about inflation and the economy for all people, making it sound like the people who have experienced the 20% inflation that he caused, he and Kamala Harris, over the last 3.5 years, that they're now paying $1,000 more a month, that somehow that doesn't exist. Same thing with the border. He tried to say the border was just fine. I mean, it's just, the American public knows it's not the truth, and you can't just get away with, are you going to believe your lying eyes? It doesn't work.
Congressman, it almost sounds like you and your party there are still running against President Biden. He is withdrawn from the ticket here. He is no longer, of course, the presumptive Democratic nominee here. It appears as though it is going to be the vice president, Kamala Harris, who takes that position.
Well, we'll see. August 7th, I guess, is the date that they're going to do some virtual nomination. Forget about the 14 million people that voted for voted for Joe Biden. We'll see what happens. I disagree that. This was pretty clear. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are one and the same, Hallie. If you think about it, she's been there for 3.5 years with him. Clearly, he hasn't been up to the job for the 3.5 years. She owns the economy, the inflation. She owns the open border. She owns all the failed policies of this administration. There's no light between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So to suggest there's some great contrast, that is a journalist construct. The American people are smarter than that.
You know, one of the things that you've suggested is that if the president is not fit to run for president, he is not fit to serve. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy called that argument from his own party, from Republicans, stupid and dumb. Those are his words, not mine, to my colleague Garrett Haake here. Do you agree? Is that an argument that you believe strategically Republicans should let go?
Look, again, we've got to focus on the fact that it's this administration with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden that has driven inflation that we haven't seen in decades, that is causing American families to suffer every day, paying 55% more for groceries or for gas, paying 20% more for rent. I mean, everything is more expensive. And he also tried to tell us that wages are up. You know what? Wages aren't keeping up because of the inflation that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden set off. And look, you know the economy was great under Donald Trump before the pandemic. That's coming back. People understand you can't have another 4 years of these failed policies, Hallie.
When you say that's coming back, I assume you're not referencing the fact that inflation is starting to come down, but just to note for viewers, that does appear to be the case. Let me ask you about your state, Congressman, because every year, every cycle, we hear a lot about Minnesota, right? I've sourced up inside the Republican Party, I hear about it, but the state has not voted for a Republican candidate since Richard Nixon in 1972. Do you believe that with the dynamics at play now, that your state could, in fact, end up red?
I do, Hallie. And I mean, I'll go back to what you just said. Let's be clear that inflation has gone down. You go ahead and keep telling Americans that are suffering when they go and buy their groceries, that can't afford to put gas in the gas tank, that can't afford to pay their rent. You go tell them that inflation is coming down. They're smarter than that. My state, like every other state, understands we cannot have 4 more years of the failed Harris-Biden policies. And I think Minnesota is more than in play. Donald Trump came within 1.5 points of winning against Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump, I believe, will win in November in Minnesota. First time in 50 years.
There was a discussion, and I saw you at the Republican National Convention, of course, last week, and prior to that was that obvious assassination attempt against former President Trump, against his life. He came out and talked about wanting to unify the nation. I talked to a number of your Republican colleagues who said now is the time to turn down the rhetoric, to try to ratchet down the tone and the temperature here in politics. Here we are now. I think it's July 24th. Is that gone? Has that disappeared? Are we just back to politics as usual?
Absolutely not. I mean, people want to report that there's that apparently if you're going to compare and contrast on the Republican side, that's calling for something other than unity. Donald Trump had the best Republican convention of my lifetime last week. We are a unified party. We have a message. They do not. And we have a candidate. They're disjointed. They're trying to claim that Kamala Harris is somehow the second coming. Hallie, she already did this. She tried to run for president before. It was the same big boost at the beginning, and what did she do? As soon as she started having to explain to the American people what she doesn't know about economic growth, what she doesn't know about the border, what she doesn't know about trying to protect the world. Listen, she wants to be the leader of the free world. She wouldn't even show up for an address by the Prime Minister Netanyahu, of our best ally, I would argue, in the world. That's someone who is not ready to be the president of the United States. Donald Trump is unifying the country, and that's why he's going to win in November.
Okay. To that point, are you equally as concerned and disturbed that J.D. Vance also did not show up for that address from the Prime Minister today?
Keep in mind that the sitting vice president typically sits next. She's supposed to sit next to the Speaker of the House, and that's not J.D. Vance. That is Kamala Harris, and she chose not to be there. And it's kind of funny because when Benjamin Netanyahu was here the last time, I believe it was the current president Joe Biden that did not show up for his address. So look, she's anti-police. She's anti-Israel. This is not what America needs, and that's why Donald Trump's going to get elected in November.
Congressman Emmer, thank you for being on, delivering what we could call the Republican response, if you will, to the president's address tonight. Appreciate it. Let me go back to my colleague Garrett Haake, who is sitting here with us, somebody who also covers Republican politics and has for a while. What we have seen, I think, is Republicans seeking to tie Kamala Harris, to tie the vice president to President Biden's record, to the Biden agenda here moving forward. That seems to be the strategy that, while maybe a little bit late coming together on Sunday into Monday, has now seemed to be in full force.
And that's a perfectly viable political strategy. We've seen it used against vice presidents quite effectively. Ask Al Gore, right? If you are the vice president, you do have to run on essentially everything that your administration does, which can be quite frustrating because as the vice president, you often don't have a lot of authority in that matter. I don't think anyone would dispute that that's a working strategy. I think what we're seeing for Republicans, and the challenge here, as Congressman Ever tried to illuminate here, is this is not just a policy contrast that Republicans are exploring. Donald Trump tonight called Kamala Harris a radical left lunatic. That's a quote. That's not a policy. That's a personal disparagement that I think is going to be the kind of thing that the Trump campaign and my sources in and around it understand they have to be a little bit careful with, because it's one thing to go after the policies that affect people. It's another to be seen sort of tearing down a person in a way that might invite a backlash with the kind of voters who you're hopeful, optimistic, perhaps overly so, that you might be able to ultimately attract down the line.
Garrett Haake, thank you very much. Let me bring in now our chief political analyst, Chuck Todd, who is joining us. He's been watching the speech. And Chuck, I'm interested in your views on this moment here. And just to step back, obviously capping an extraordinary couple of weeks in American politics and capping this moment for President Biden of pressure building on him since late June, nearly a month ago, that he ultimately on Sunday acquiesced to, stepping off the ticket, and tonight delivering his rationale to Americans in front of his family as to why.
Well, actually, I don't think he told us why, for what it's worth. I really feel like if there was
the fresh voices, new generation piece, you don't.
I think that's what you say, right? This is a guy who wanted to seek a second term, Hallie. This is a guy who fought a lot of people on this issue over the last 3 weeks. So, I don't think he addressed the elephant in the room. He didn't deal with this. He just sort of acknowledged he couldn't unite his party. And I don't mean to sound, I don't want to sound a sour note. I thought it was it was the right tone, right? I don't think I wondered how much he would be saying, look at me. And he didn't, not in the ways he'd been doing in those interviews as he was trying to salvage his candidacy. But he didn't address to me, which was his biggest failing as president, which is the same failing Donald Trump had as president, is his inability to bring the country together. Now, he talked about what he framed the campaign to be, right? That basically the democracy is on the line. But I thought maybe he would lament and talk about his own frustration that he couldn't do this. And maybe a little bit more of that. Look, it's been something I've been looking for from him. Like, I don't think he ever fully acknowledged why his party abandoned him. They abandoned him. He never acknowledged why everybody was so upset with him that night, that he couldn't take the fight to the former president, right? He couldn't retort. He couldn't make a message. And I do think he's trying to get some credibility back. I just think it would strengthen his credibility if he were truly, especially when I heard him say tonight, I always said I was going to tell you the truth. I was going to be straightforward. I don't feel like he gave us a direct answer on why he stepped down from this campaign. And I do wish he would have tackled the reality of why his political standing is so weak. And it really, I think, it's not about the policies. I think it's a frustration, and I certainly think with a chunk of voters, a frustration that his election did not turn the page on Donald Trump.
Chuck, I'm going to ask you to stand by for a second. I want to bring in somebody who knows the president, somebody who we've spoken with before, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is joining us now. Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know it's been a busy one.
Thanks, Hallie.
Can you take a moment to reflect on what we heard from President Biden here in this speech for him that was critical, not just at this political moment, but in so many ways for his legacy?
This was a speech that reminded America of why they elected President Biden to begin with. It was a defense of democracy. He made the case that he was going to put the country in front of his personal ambition. And I was listening to Chuck, and I know in a media perfect world, you wish he would have gone through every detail. But I think this is more of a summary. You know, he has 10 minutes. He's not going to go on and on. He's passed the torch to someone else. So I don't know. He didn't want to focus on himself, but he was talking about why he did it. And that was his words, "It's a republic if you can keep it," quoting Benjamin Franklin. And he basically said to America, now it's in your hands. It's a republic if you can keep it. So I like the fact, yes, he went over some of his accomplishments in the infrastructure bill and the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and taking on the world. But I think in the end, this really was an argument for our democracy. It's why he came in, and it's how he's ending.
So then what role would you like to see the president play? And I'm talking politically, not conducting the business of office over the next 5 months, but politically. Do you want to see him on the campaign trail? Do you think that he would be an asset rallying behind his vice president if she does end up becoming the nominee?
I do, and I think you will see him on that campaign trail. I don't think there's a campaign where he hasn't come to northern Minnesota, where he just actually delivered a major bridge between Minnesota and Wisconsin. I think you'll see him with some of those amazing projects that he and Vice President Harris delivered. You're also going to see Jill out there. She's always been an incredible campaigner. So there's so much work to do governing right now, and he mentioned some of it in his brief speech. But I also think you're going to see him out on the campaign trail, as he said, passing the torch, yes, but making clear what's at stake. And given that he was the one that came in and beat Donald Trump, in part bringing in moderate Republicans and independents and getting people rallied around the cause of democracy. And here we are now, where Kamala Harris is going to be prosecuting the case, and she is a good prosecutor, that democracy still matters, against a guy that literally called the Secretary of State of Georgia a Republican and asked him for 11,000 more votes.
You yourself know a thing or two from my recollections of covering your 2020 primary about what it is like to have a past as a prosecutor, of course, and to have that be used as a liability politically and not an asset. We have heard Vice President Harris in just the last couple of campaign appearances she's done this week frame this as her as a prosecutor, as she has now said, I know Donald Trump's type, in her words, and understanding what it would take to prosecute the case against him. Do you believe that that is a successful strategy for her, or are there potential weaknesses on that front?
I do, because this is a man that has racked up over 100 felony indictments and over a dozen convictions. So it is the case to make, because she is someone that has enforced the law. And she is someone that's going to be out there on the stage making the case for protecting our democracy, which, by the way, as you know, in 2022, I think over 30% of people that voted Democratic in those midterm elections said that was a major reason for them to vote against election deniers, because even if they may not have agreed with the Democratic Party on every single thing, they did believe in our democracy. And she is also, as we all know, as someone who I got to see cross-examine those Supreme Court justice nominees, she is uniquely going to be able to make the case that he put those people on the court, which he himself has said he's proud to have done, that overturned Roe v. Wade and took the rights away, and now a third of women are living in states under extreme abortion bans. That's going to be a pretty clear-cut case as well.
Of course, before we get to November, we have to get to, I guess, August 7th, which is the date by which, a source tells our team, the Harris campaign, now formerly Biden campaign, expects to be naming a running mate, or hopes to be. Your state's governor, Tim Walz, is on the, let's call it, medium list of contenders who are apparently being vetted by the Harris team. Have you spoken to him about this possibility? Would you be satisfied if you weren't to be named her running mate?
Of course I have. He would be a great vice president. We're friends. We came into office together when he served in Congress. As you know, he is a former member of the Military National Guard and has been a just excellent and wonderful governor. We also know there'll be other people. Kamala Harris is going to go on speed dating with these candidates. However, she knows all of them. So this isn't like a brand new thing. The names that have emerged are all people she knows well. And I'm sure that she's going to pick the best person. But yes, Tim's just would be a great vice president.
Any concerns about that compressed vetting timeline, though, Senator? I mean, you know that vetting typically is a process that takes a minute. Now we're looking down, possibly as soon as the next couple of weeks, according to what the campaign has said.
You know, I might be concerned if they had a list of people who had not served or who in government or who just a whole list, not that we wouldn't have one or two be considered, but someone that had not been vetted for anything before. All the candidates that I've seen, the list of candidates have been vetted in major elections by not just by the voters, but they've been vetted by their opponents over and over again.
Senator Amy Klobuchar, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know a busy one for you. Much appreciated. Let me bring in now somebody who has covered President Biden, formerly Vice President Biden, before that, Senator Biden for a long time, Mike Memoli. And let me just start here, Mem. I want to get to some news that Joe Biden is making. But just your thoughts, your overall, was this the speech that you expected based on the reporting you've done?
I had heard this was going to be a personal speech, and it did feel intensely personal at times, right? You could sense the disappointment of having to surrender the office that he said, I revere this office, but he believes his country, he loves his country more. I think this disappointment is one that's shared widely in the White House and among many supporters of the president. I've been talking
some of whom we're watching today.
Exactly, and it's an important moment for him to begin to bring everyone back into the fold. And I thought it was so interesting to see a tweet that just was posted by the First Lady.
Let's talk about that. I think our team has made that here, has pulled that into a graphic. You see it here in her handwriting. She says, to those who never wavered, to those who refused to doubt, to those who always believed, my heart is full of gratitude. She goes on to say, thank you for the trust you put in Joe. Now it's time to put that trust in Kamala.
Now, this is significant because this is the first time we've heard from her, really.
That's right.
And she is, in effect, endorsing Kamala Harris as well. But I thought the first part is so interesting, to those who never wavered.
That's right.
Because,
to the true believers, if you will.
Because she has written herself in her book that my husband doesn't hold grudges, I hold them for him. And we know that there are a lot of people around the president who are still angry, frankly, at the view that many in the party drove him out of this race. And he is going to still be a loyal party soldier, as he has been his whole career, but I think there is that feeling that extends to them. And look at these photos. Yeah. It's really striking to see the family gathering together in this moment.
That's from tonight, I should let folks know. That's the Oval Office. You see Hunter Biden, you see his daughter, his wife there.
Ashley Biden, his daughter, yeah. And this is, you know, you can see Ashley's wearing an Olympic-themed shirt. They're about to fly to Paris for the Olympics, right? And so this is actually a moment that they're all going to be together as a family, but then split apart for some time. And so just having covered him for 17 years now, believe it or not, every decision he's had to make is a family decision, and this is just an intensely personal family moment. There are some members of his grandchildren there as well. What a moment in the Oval Office for this family.
He also, I was struck by something, and we talked about it earlier on our special report, the idea that he said, does America still, and let me pull up the exact quote because I don't want to botch it here, but he said, does character in public life still matter? This idea of the character case that he's been making against former President Trump in his political life, but it feels deeply held for him as well.
Well, what's so interesting about this moment now for him is, what do we see in every poll is the most important issue in this election? It's the cost of living, it's inflation, it's the economy. And
by the way, the border and immigration.
And the president was going to be out there, if he was still running himself as a candidate, trying to speak to those issues. But you can see in this speech tonight what he cares most about. He does feel that this is an inflection point, as he put it, for our democracy. He does feel that our democracy is really at a tipping point. And so in some ways, he's freed up now to focus on that which he does think is most important in this election, and allows the vice president, her running mate, to focus on those bread and butter issues while he makes the higher argument about what's really at stake for our democracy.
Mike Memoli, thank you. Hang out if you can just for a second here. I want to see if we still have Chuck Todd joining us as well, because Chuck, I had to, forgive me, rudely interrupt our conversation to bring in Senator Klobuchar there, who was listening to what you had to say and who I think disagreed a little bit. She sort of said, hey, he's not going to get into his whole thing in a 10-minute speech from the Oval.
Look, she's in a tough spot. She's not going to sit there and get caught agreeing with any critique right now. I mean, she's a good member of the Democratic Party, right?
Well,
that's not something that, and tonight's not a night that if you're a member of the party, anybody wants to be out there seen as even nitpicking at all. So I understand that. It was a tough position for her to be in.
I also think it's interesting when you look at sort of the numbers that have come out so far. We'll talk more about Vice President Harris and how she's doing against former President Trump, but specifically about the Democratic Party in and of itself. And something like 90%, 87% of Democrats believe that it was the right move for President Biden to step off the ticket. One of our former colleagues made a joke that, like, you can't get 90% of people to agree they want to see the sunrise in the morning, right? That's a pretty big and a pretty staggering number there. I wonder how you see it.
Look, I believe that 6 months ago, had he made this decision, his approval rating would be over 50% with the entire country right now. I mean, I really believe that a large chunk of the frustration that the country had with him had to do with concerns about his ability to serve going forward and sort of not feeling as if he had the vigor to defend and all of those things. And I think everybody has a different Rorschach test of what they see as vigor and things like that. So, and look, that happens, right? I mean, you know, Bob Dole became one of the most popular Republicans in the Republican Party after he lost to Bill Clinton. You know, so sometimes those things happen. And who knows, by October, you know, Joe Biden might have an approval rating over 50. And Kamala Harris is going to be trying to bring him to northern Minnesota or to Macomb County, Michigan, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Right now, I don't think you will see a lot of him on the campaign trail. But you never know.
You think we'll see any of him?
I think, look, you don't see a lot of presidents when their vice presidents are on there. I mean, Bill Clinton was very rarely on the trail. That was by choice. Al Gore didn't want him around a lot. He did some campaigning. Ronald Reagan didn't do a lot of campaigning for his sitting vice president. Even Barack Obama for Hillary Clinton did a couple of things, but not a ton. So I don't expect a lot anyway.
Okay.
And I think I expect him more on the fundraising circuit, Hallie, more than anything else. But I'll go back to something else. The best thing he can do for her, get that ceasefire. That's forget anything else. The biggest contribution he can make to her campaign is getting that ceasefire before the start of college.
That's super interesting. Chuck Todd, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to stand by. I want to come back to the table here with Mike Memoli, who's still joining us, Garrett Haake, who's still joining us. So let's get into the Harris of it all, as Chuck has alluded to there. Somebody who is in Houston, I believe that she, based on our reporting, watched that address from there. This is obviously, when the president talks about passing the torch, she's the one on the receiving end, in his view. And nobody has come forward to challenge her. And she moved incredibly quickly to consolidate the Democratic Party behind her in the span of like 36 hours. It was fast.
And you have this now explosion of enthusiasm from Democrats. They felt like pent up for months, kind of watching the president, hoping he would be able to make the case, and then seeing ultimately that he couldn't.
And can I tell you the stat that I think illustrates that the most? Vote.org came out and said that nearly 40,000 people registered in the 48 hours after President Biden dropped out and endorsed Harris. That is more than when Taylor Swift told people to get out there and register to vote by like a few thousand.
And she's still in the bullpen, so they can call on her to help make this argument as well. But what's interesting is I reached out to the VP's team about what are we going to hear from her now?
Yeah.
You know, and they said this is the president's night, but she has been out there every day. You've heard her making the effusive case about his record. But other Democrats are saying, okay, now it's time to move on, right? This is now the Harris campaign in every way. She needs to be talking about her vision. She needs to be talking about what she has accomplished and what she hopes to accomplish. The president will still have a role, but it's time to, if you're going to pass the torch, let them run with it. You know?
And she has an opportunity to take advantage of the calendar right now. I'm developing this theory in my head that we might have experienced last week, what I'm calling peak Trump. I mean, if you're Donald Trump and his campaign right now, think about the run you've had since the last debate. You crushed it in your own view in the last debate. You essentially knocked your opponent out of the race. Joe Biden, this time last week, was in free fall as a nominee. Donald Trump had just survived getting shot in the head. His party was rallying around him.
He had gotten a Supreme Court win just a couple weeks prior to that.
Supreme Court win. That was all the same week, Hallie, believe it or not. Well, excuse me. No, I'm thinking of Judge Cannon's win. So another major court win. His court cases were disappearing. His party was rallying behind him. The fact that he survived this assassination attempt was drawing perhaps millions of eyeballs to his convention who might not have otherwise paid him any attention. And he managed to pull basically out of the margin of error in polling that we were seeing nationwide. And a lot of those same polls this week, right back to a margin of error race for Kamala Harris, who's now going to have an opportunity to introduce her running mate to the country.
First of all, to officially clinch the nomination.
Clinch the nomination, right. Induce her running mate, have a presumably well-produced convention of her own. If Chuck is right and President Biden's able to secure a ceasefire, like the calendar incredibly works to her advantage. If you're Donald Trump, what else do you have to slow that momentum other than perhaps another debate, which will be a very different animal than the one you just experienced? So I think, I had Kevin McCarthy in that interview yesterday. He and I were talking a little bit off camera, and we talked about the idea that Kamala Harris in a long campaign has a lot of problems, but in a short campaign has a lot of opportunities. And I think you see the way the calendar might allow her to kind of step on that momentum and now to take our torch running metaphor a little bit further, kind of run with it across in a sprint race, not a longer distance.
We've got to have a lot of Olympic tie-ins here, right?
I'm just trying to build the company.
Good Comcast soldier. Thank you much for that. To that point, though, Garrett brings up something interesting, this idea, the prospect of a debate. Possibly September 10th was what was already previously on the books when it was a Biden-Trump matchup. Now there's a question of does that happen on ABC News as planned? There's also now the prospect being raised of a debate a week later. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on a debate stage. What does that look like? And what do people that you talk to say about a moment like that?
Well, remember, we've really only seen, there are some memorable debate moments from Kamala Harris. I think of 2019 when she took it to Joe Biden, right? That was probably the peak of her campaign, her candidacy when she was running. We didn't really see much of her since. The debate against Mike Pence was mostly, the thing we remember is the fly, right? I mean,
that's so true.
That was not a really distinguishing.
Which goes to show you that you can prep in all kinds of ways for a debate. You can have all kinds of strategy sessions and mocks, et cetera, but you never know if there's just a
I think
bug.
what Democrats were most disappointed about from President Biden was finally you have the guy on the stage, take the case to him. And Kamala Harris is almost built for this moment. It's interesting, I was at the LA Times for a bit and covered her when she won her election. And she talked about the fact that she was celebrating her victory on the night that a room full of California Democrats were mourning the defeat of Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. Her career out of California on the national scene almost began with Donald Trump. And so this is, in some ways, the moment is finding her in an interesting way. As a former attorney general, we've seen how eager she is to take to to Donald Trump in a personal way.
Which was a liability for her 4 years ago.
That's right. In a very different context, essentially, in the Democratic campaign. The prospect of a debate with Donald Trump, from the Trump campaign perspective, I think they would be wise to view this very carefully, because to me it screams trap to go into this debate. Donald Trump, some of his worst moments on the public stage are when he is confronted by a strong woman and tries to confront back. He was, the
looming over
body
Hillary
language
Clinton,
was weird with Hillary Clinton. The first debate in the 2016 primary and his back and forth with Megyn Kelly became a moment that was an extremely disturbing moment to a lot of female voters who just didn't like the way he handled that at all. He does not do well in those situations. And if the Donald Trump who appeared on the rally stage tonight takes sort of that approach, kind of shouting about a radical liberal on a debate stage, I think a lot of those female voters who we think are core to this race are going to have a hard time to swallow it.
Garrett Haake, Mike Memole, glad to be with both of you. Thank you. Our thanks to Chuck Todd as well. I want to bring in now our NBC News contributor, historian Michael Beschloss, because Michael, and it's good to have you with us. This, in so many ways, was President Biden tonight with this address, writing what he hopes will be the first draft of how he will be viewed in the history books. Sure. How do you see it?
Well, I think what he was trying to make the case for, and did it quite eloquently, is to say that I came into this presidency concerned about democracy. And what he was referring to, of course, was he came in 14 days after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So if you have to look at a theme for this presidency, I think he's quite justified in saying, at home, I tried to do everything I could to protect the rule of law and restore democratic institutions. Abroad, I tried to restore NATO and prevent, for instance, Ukraine from being overcome by its neighbor, Russia, because if that were allowed, that could happen all over the world. And also, I think if historians are looking at the good things about Joe Biden to recommend to future Americans, one of them is very important, and that is he knew when to leave. Most leaders don't. They usually hang on if they can. Joe Biden could have this past week said, yes, I know a lot of people want me to leave, and yes, I think a lot of pollsters are saying I have no path to victory, but I've got the delegates, so there. Watch me surprise you. Instead, he said, I think I should step down and also pass power to a next generation. That's something that happens all too seldom in American life.
You know, we are looking at some images here of President Biden just moments ago appearing, he has a microphone in hand, appearing to address the staff members who watched him in this moment. We know that he had his family members. We've shown those photographs, Jill Biden, Hunter Biden, Ashley Biden watching him from the Oval Office, other staffers watching from elsewhere in the building. What do you think this moment means to them, Michael?
This is, they have not absorbed this yet. It will only hit them, and it will only hit the president probably in a few days or more, because right now they're trying to deal with the immediate situation. And I know that from studying other presidents who gave up power, like President Truman, 1952, President Johnson in 1968. He gave his speech in the Oval Office. His wife, Lady Bird, sat in the room, and then the two of them went into that room next to the Oval Office, which now has been turned into basically a dining room. But in those days, it was a lounge. So Johnson and his family watched the speech. His daughter, Lucy, cried. There are pictures of that. And that's what's going to be happening among the aides and among the family the next few days. It's one reason why it is so hard for a president to say, this is my time to go.
Michael Beschloss, thank you so much. And that is what President Biden did in his primetime address to the nation from the Oval Office tonight, acknowledging that while he reveres the office, it is time to pass the torch to, in his words, a new, fresh, younger generation, calling his Vice President Kamala Harris capable and tough as he has now endorsed her for the Democratic ticket. Lots to watch here in the world of politics in the days to come, and we're glad you're doing it right here with us on NBC News Now. For all of us here at NBC, thanks so much for watching. We've got a lot more coverage picking up right now.
Good evening. I'm Ellison Barber in for Tom Yamas. President Biden delivering one of the most consequential speeches of his 50-year political career. The president speaking to the nation from the Oval Office on his decision to drop out of the 2024 race.
I fear this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think it's more important than any title.
The president surrounded by his family sitting off camera, but to the left of him for this historic 11-minute address. President Biden officially passing the torch to Vice President Kamala Harris, giving high praise to the de facto nominee.
Just a few months, the American people will choose the course of America's future. I made my choice. I've made my views known. I would like to thank our great Vice President Kamala Harris. She's experienced, she's tough, she's capable. She's been an incredible partner to me and a leader for our country.
So will Harris carry on his policies or carve her own path in Washington? And how much will President Biden join her on the campaign trail, if at all? The president also laying out his plans for his final months in office, hoping to reframe this final chapter of his political legacy that's recently been overshadowed by the unraveling of his campaign. We want to get right to NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell for more on this speech and what it means moving forward. Kelly, just take us into the initial reactions that you were hearing from sources both inside of the White House and on Capitol Hill. What did people make of this speech?
Well, in many ways, this was a giant exhale after some weeks of real turmoil for the president, for his family, for his party, and by extension for the nation. To have a sitting president choose to not run again is in and of itself an historic moment. And so the president using the Oval Office to talk about that. There will be some who will hear the politics of this night, where he is vouching for his vice president, explaining that he is handing off to her and that she will be the candidate. And he implores the American people to make a decision that favors democracy and to lay out the stakes. Some will hear that in political terms. Others will see it as a sitting president who is choosing to not go forward beyond this first term, to not compete for a second term, even though he said he believed his time in office merited a second term, but that he also thought that there is a time for fresh voices and, in fact, younger voices. And so in those ways, it's a historic speech capping a half century of public life in different offices, from the U.S. Senate to the vice presidency and then in the Oval Office as president, and laying out what the public should expect over the next several months, that he has plans that he wants to try to execute on issues that are core to his agenda, and some new areas that he has not talked about publicly much, including some reforms for the Supreme Court and ideas for dealing with that. But this was a speech about what really inspired him to run in the first place in 2020. He didn't use the phrase in quite the way we've heard him do it before, but the soul of America. He invoked historical figures from George Washington to Benjamin Franklin to Abraham Lincoln to talk about the importance of the choice and maintaining democracy. Again, those who don't support Joe Biden will hear that as overtly political, but he laid the groundwork now for the final chapter of his public life, for the final months of his campaign. And then he went out into the Rose Garden, where staff, the employees that have been a part of his team, and certainly many of them who have supported him politically, were gathered. They had watched the speech on screens. They gathered for refreshments and to hear from the president. As you mentioned, his close family members in the Oval Office, which is unusual for a major address. That's typically not the case, but it gives you a sense of the importance and the personal overtones of all of this. The family has always been part of his decision-making structure, and they certainly were when it comes to this decision. And the First Lady and some members of the family will actually leave tonight for the Olympics, representing the United States at the opening ceremony and doing some other events at the Olympics on behalf of the United States. So this was a night of real emotion for the president. Difficult decision, as he made clear, but one where he says that he is putting the good of the country in front of his own personal ambition. Ellison?
Kelly, I do want to play a little more for our viewers and just get your reaction to this one moment in particular where it in some ways was sort of Biden's final words on the evening, where he talked about this idea of America and whether or not we have kings, dictators. Let's listen, and then we'll talk right after.
The great thing about America is here, kings and dictators do not rule. The people do. History is in your hands. The power is in your hands. The idea of America lies in your hands. We just have to keep faith, keep the faith, and remember who we are. We're the United States of America, and there's simply nothing beyond our capacity when we do it together. So let's act together, preserve our democracy.
You know, it's hard, given the rhetoric we've heard on the campaign trail, to take Trump out of this speech. But at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think he mentioned him by name tonight. But in that moment, I'm curious, from what you know about this president and his team, when he was talking about that idea of kings and dictators and the choice being in the hands of Americans, do you think he was hoping to just inspire America and Americans about what we could be? Or do you think that was really more directly a warning about the possibilities in his view of another Trump term?
Well, he did not mention Donald Trump by name, and from the Oval Office, it would be unusual for him to do so, with the exception of talking about the political violence that took place 10 days ago or so. Clearly, when he makes a reference to kings and dictators, that is about the forces that are at play in the world currently and what we have seen over time. There are these populist impulses. There are authoritarians who are seeking to gain advantage, and clearly Donald Trump has talked about the notion of being a dictator on day one, something that Joe Biden has referenced in his overtly political speeches a number of times. So this does walk right up to the line of politics, but he did try to put it in the trappings of American democracy, the choice for the American people, whatever choice they choose to make, but to exercise that right to preserve democracy. That was really the underpinning of what his remarks were tonight, and certainly part of what will be a long national farewell.
Kelly O'Donnell, amazing reporting as always. We might come back to you. Thank you. We appreciate it. We are going to turn now over to Capitol Hill to get the Democratic response to President Biden's address to the nation this evening. And joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman from California, Barbara Lee. Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you were busy, still working late at night. We appreciate you being here. Let's just get right to this. What do you think was the most significant part of President Biden's address tonight?
First, let me say it was the epitome of a president as a public servant, a president who fights and has fought for over 50 years to protect our democracy, a president who loves people, and a president who believes in the power of the people. And he was remarkable tonight in terms of his values. You know, not often do you hear presidents, elected officials talk about being happy as a public servant. I mean, this is who he is. And I am telling you, I was overwhelmed with just listening to him tonight, because it was with a sense of gratitude that I listened to him. And here he's thanking us. And so we have to really reflect on his legacy. He laid out some of what he and Vice President Harris have delivered for the American people, for our planet. But Lord knows there's a whole lot more. But in doing that, people have to stop and think about his legacy and what he has done and thank him for it. And that's what I was thinking. I wish I could call him and just say, thank you, Mr. President. As a defender of our democracy and as a true public servant, the integrity, the honesty, and the values that he talked about is extremely important, because oftentimes elected officials and public servant individuals, which we are as elected, forget about our values of service. And he was truly a public servant tonight. And I think his values touched everyone. And hopefully everyone can kind of search their soul and figure out what they're doing to help this become a better world for everyone, because he certainly talked about that in many ways tonight.
Congresswoman, when you think about where the Democratic Party is right now, some of the difficult discussions everyone within the party has had to have, both on Capitol Hill and off. I think about a statement just a couple of days ago from Black Lives Matter, where the group talked about saying, hey, we feel like this is an undemocratic process. We wish things had gone differently in terms of how we get to who is the next person at the top of the ticket, not wanting delegates to be leaned on so hard. When you look at those different discussions, particularly the ones that have been happening inside of your own party, do you feel like this speech set the stage to turn the page? Are we going to see a more unified Democratic Party moving forward, or are there still some discussions and debates to be had internally?
Look, this is what democracy is all about. Our Democratic Party is very democratic, and so we're going to have people with different points of views. But I can tell you one thing. There are those who are working day and night to unify the party, including the president and our vice president. And so we'll get there, and we have to have these discussions because we want people to vote for democracy and vote to protect our democracy in November. And so these discussions are good. We have to listen. We have to take in what people are saying, and we have to honor their values and their viewpoints and move forward to unify. And I believe that is going to happen. I trust that. I mean, passing the baton to the next generation is extremely important for us to talk about. And so I'm not worried, but I know we have a lot of work to do, and that's what we all have to do. And I think the president tonight set that framework and that standard for all of us to try to live up to.
And Congresswoman, I know you do have votes tonight, so please stop us if you need to go and do your job. That is, of course, first priority, and we understand. But if we have time, I do want to just ask you, you endorsed Kamala Harris when she ran for president the first time back in 2020. You're endorsing her again now. Why do you believe Harris is the candidate for America and the candidate right now?
She's prepared. She's experienced. She knows what she's doing. She's been the vice president for almost 4 years. She was our attorney general in California. She was district attorney. She understands the world in which we live. She's a global leader. I actually have been with her abroad at the Munich Security Summit, for example. World leaders listen to her, and she listens. And she's a very great representative for the United States and for democracy and for empowerment and respecting other countries, but also respecting our values in the world, on the world stage. So she's very smart, and she's very strategic, and she connects with people. She's a unifier. I've seen her with people of all backgrounds, and she finds that common ground, and she knows what people need, and that's, they want their lives better, and they want peace, and they want security, both here at home and abroad. And so President Biden, once again, we have to be grateful that he took the step to ask her to be his vice president. And here now, he has endorsed her early to be the next president of the United States. There's no one else as prepared as Vice President Kamala Harris is to take this baton and move forward with it.
Congresswoman, I see some people walking by the doors, so I think it might be time for you to go. Is that right? I see her. Thank you so much for your insights and your time on such a historic evening. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, for more insight into President Biden's address tonight, let's bring in NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd. Chuck, thank you for joining us. Same courtesy to you, by the way. If you need to go do something, you let us know, and we'll get you out of that chair quickly as well. We appreciate you staying late tonight. What is your first reaction to this address? Do you think the president accomplished what he was hoping to accomplish with this speech?
Well, I guess I am curious what he wanted to do with this speech, and I say that because, look, I thought it was a very gracious speech, and I thought certainly he was trying to put the best version of himself and of his presidency in that light. I was looking for two things that he didn't tackle, and I wish he had. One was a little more direct of it's clear he wanted to run again. And sort of dealing with that issue directly about it. He did not want to deal with that issue. And look, that's very personal, and perhaps we can understand that. And the second, though, was he had, one of the main pillars of his candidacy and one of the main pillars of his inauguration speech was to bring this country together. And he has failed at doing that. Now, perhaps anybody would have failed in the first 3.5 years. Perhaps it was an impossible task. I wanted a little bit more on that. I think there's certainly some allusions to it. It was slightly more political than I expected. He framed, he really wanted to frame an election argument in the best possible way, I think, perhaps for the vice president. But I think it's a reminder, this is how he was framing his reelection bid. And he sort of stayed with that theme. And so that's why when I say political, meaning it did feel as if he was like, look, there's a campaign ahead. You have a choice to make, and the choice is democracy or not, right? And those are some pretty stark words. I don't think he was writing that for history. I think he was writing that for this campaign in this moment. But look, it was certainly, you could tell that he didn't have this sort of weight on his shoulder anymore, though, right? All of his previous speeches, particularly the last 2 months, Allison, he's been trying to talk faster. He's been trying to, it's almost like he's trying so hard to show he had energy to do it that it was sort of sometimes distracting. What I did appreciate tonight, he finally felt comfortable being him again. And I think that was probably the most important tone setter of all.
Let's listen to another soundbite, because I want to get your reaction to this one particular moment that stood out to me when he was talking about his record and also why he decided to drop out of the election this year. Let's listen and then we'll talk after.
Nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. There is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
At times you listen to that and you're like, okay, well, saving democracy, was that really the reason behind why he got out of the race? Or was it just all of the pressure from allies, the call that NBC has reported on with Senator Chuck Schumer, basically saying, hey, you've lost Senate Democrats, and others saying, we really don't think you can win. Was that him trying to sort of rewrite the narrative of why he decided to step out now? Or is this a multiple things can be true at once?
Look, I certainly think it felt like a rewrite of the narrative, Allison, I'll be honest. And yes, both things can be true. Let me put it another way. Had he uttered those words in March of this year, let's say he had been on the same track as LBJ, and he had done this in March of 2024, allowing for a couple of months and all this stuff, I think those words would have rang truer to those that were listening. But I mean, these last 3 weeks, we can't particularly us in the media, we can't unremember them, right? We are well aware there was a massive pressure campaign. They were not taking no for an answer, right, on this front. So that's where, look, I think he was trying to put the best version of that story in light. And if Kamala Harris wins, that narrative might have a chance to take hold. But if she loses, I don't think that narrative will ever take hold, to be frank.
Do you think, Chuck, this question, and we're hearing it so much, I think, in terms of just public faces we see on TV from Republicans saying if he can't finish running for re-election, he shouldn't finish out his term. But I do think those are some questions that I have heard people across the political spectrum also asking in different settings, right? Whether it was when I was in Milwaukee or just out and about with friends. Do you think that question remains moving forward, even though he seemed to really try and stop it by saying, here's what I'm going to do?
I think I think that's a Rorschach test, Allison. I'll be frank on that. I think it's one of those things that's very subjective. I don't think he made a strong case on that about the next 4 years, but I also think it's a silly argument that, he doesn't have 6 more, be able to do this job for six more months. I think a very much more plausible is trying to campaign for re-election and be leader of the free world at 81 years old. Maybe that was too much, but not doing the campaign, taking that pressure off, I think, frankly, frees him up to do a better job in the next 6 months than perhaps he felt like he could do in the last 6 months.
Do you think we will see Biden out on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris in the near future, or do you think that will be a wait and see and only at the big moments?
I think it's only at the big moments. I think the next time we see him in a campaign setting will probably be the Monday night of the Democratic convention. That is a traditional night for outgoing presidents of either party, whichever convention it is, to sort of have their moment. And I think perhaps, there's a more robust speech there. I'll be curious to see whether that is, they want him in that 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock big primetime speech, or whether he doesn't want to do that. Maybe he doesn't want to do the big 30-minute stem winder. Maybe he wants to keep it tighter and smaller. But look, I wouldn't be surprised now that he's decided not to run, that he kind of gets a little bit of a thank you honeymoon in the polls, and that his numbers will start to soften up. His personal ratings will go up. If you tell me Kamala Harris wants him stumping in northeastern Pennsylvania, near his hometown of Scranton, go to Wilkes-Barre, do some trips to Philadelphia. That seems to make a lot of sense. Have him at fundraisers. That makes a lot of sense. And if you told me he was going to do a big rally, I could see a Biden-Obama-Harris event, right, towards the end of the campaign. But I do think it'll be more selective. And because part of it is Harris needs to establish her own identity. If she's, look, his poll numbers aren't enough to lean on anyway. But even if they were, she needs to get out of his shadow, and at times she's going to have to distance herself from some of the more from perhaps an unpopular policy or two. I kind of expect it on the border, but we'll see.
Okay, I'm going to go completely rogue, and I will get back on to asking you about future steps. But I am just curious, Chuck. You have such a wealth of knowledge. You know the history of presidents of D.C.
Yeah.
When people are looking at this moment, and I think we talk so much about young voters right now, and so many people have different emotions, feelings, worries in this moment. I'm curious if we could have you reflect a little on just where our country is right now. When you talk to, I know you're a dad, when you talk to your kids and look back at this time, this last year, 2 years, particularly the last 25 days, what is it that you say to them if, regardless of their politics, they're like, Dad, I'm scared. I feel like these are moments I only saw in history books. What are we doing? What's happening?
Well, Ellison, that's how I make myself feel better, is I go back and say, look, we've been through this before. I sometimes in darker moments say to myself, is this the 1850s or the 1950s? And the reason I say that is the 1850s didn't end well. The 1950s ended better. Okay, the 1960s were tumultuous, but we didn't end up in a civil war. The 1860s were a different story. obviously. So, look, I actually look at history as sort of a reminder. We've been here before. The Republican Party has been there before. The 1920s and 30s version of the Republican Party and the conservative movement looks awfully familiar with what we have today. So the point is that, and in some ways, if you know it's happened before, then you know there's a path out, right? And ultimately, you got to trust the voters. I say this to my kids. I say, look, the voters, we eventually get it right, but one of President Obama's favorite expressions was, the arc of history bends towards justice. But one of the things I like to remind people is that sometimes arcs have to go backwards before they go forwards, right? Just like you ever see one of those overpasses? Sometimes you have to go backwards in order to make progress, right? And, I think we're on one of these loops right now, okay? And we'll get there. I'm long-term optimistic and always short-term a little bit nervous.
All right, and then looking ahead, Harris should be on the campaign trail soon. We had Donald Trump today in Charlotte, North Carolina. How soon do you think we will get a Harris VP pick? I know you've said take time on this, think about it, but what's the realistic timeline and who do you think's top?
Well, look, the DNC has talked themselves into this idea that they have to do it by August 7th. So they're going to do it by August. It seems pretty clear that they want to do that. I think that they're sort of trumping up this deadline. There's some other reasons, I think, that they don't want a roll call at the convention. I understand that. They're trying to limit the amount of unscripted moments at the convention. There's still a concern. You saw Washington, D.C. today with all the protests over Gaza. That is still a large concern among organizers for the Chicago convention. So there's been, that's always been an extra feature of the, quote, early roll call, is that you limit some of the unscripted moments that the convention could provide. But you're asking me who I think's right now. I mean, when you start to look at the list, and it, ultimately, I hope she spends some time with all of them so she knows for sure if she clicks. But when you look at her deficits and the attributes of the potential shortlist, Mark Kelly seems to me, rise above everybody else. He was critical of the Biden-Harris administration's border policies when he was running for re-election in 22. He's been vetted by those two campaigns. Those were $100 million campaigns in Arizona. Oh, did I say it was in Arizona, right? Swing state. The issue of political violence isn't something that just touched former President Trump. This is something that has touched Mark Kelly and his family and former Congresswoman, his wife, Gabrielle Gifford. So when you look at sort of a lot of assets, and it's interesting, we had this focus group last night, and, of all the people on the short list, he was the only one voters recognized without hearing a title. And it's because he's done something else outside of politics, orbiting this earth, right? And, the first time he appeared on the Today Show was in the late 90s with his brother talking about the twins going up into space. So he's been a part of our culture, which I think in a short campaign, if you're Kamala Harris, it's an added get to know you, right? It helps. He already has some seeds planted in the American mind of who he is. And they're very positive. We love our astronauts, right? So I just think you look at those attributes. There's a lot of other good attributes for Governor Shapiro, Governor Beshear, Governor Cooper. But I see why Kelly appears to be first on the short list.
It is a unprecedented, unbelievable time that we are living in. And Chuck Todd, we are always so grateful and thankful to have you and your insights here to help us walk through it all.